We are learning Lekutei Siches, Chelek Tezayin, Parshas Pekudei, the first Siche, on page 458. In this Siche, the Rabbi will address the famous question regarding both of the Parshas Vayakel and Pekudei, where the Torah repeats all of the details of the Mishkan, even though everything was said earlier in the Parshas of Truma and Tetzaveh. Nevertheless, the Torah over here reviews all the details, and in fact, as we'll see in the continuation of the Sicha, it's reviewed 3 times. Not less than 3 times does the Torah go over all of the details of the Mishkan and the Kalim, which is a tremendous wonder. Why does the Torah, which is so precise in every single word it says, do such a thing? So this will be addressed over here in the Sicha, Al Pi Pshuti Shel Mikra, and then in the end of the Sicha, B'Pnimiyus Anyanim. Shengeret fil mol. We already said many times, as Rashi, B'Pirushei al HaTorah, stellt sich up und is mefarish, jeder Inyan in welcher es fällt Bier, B'Pshutei Shel Mikra. Rashi stops and explains every single point that requires clarification in the pshat of the pasuk. Und wenn Rashi hat nicht kein Asbara auf an Inyan im Pshutei Shel Mikra, when Rashi does not find any explanation, schreibt eini ideya, then Rashi says, I don't know the meaning. So the very fact that Rashi writes, sometimes, I don't know, means that he always says something when it needs clarification. Either he writes the pshat, or he says, I don't know. So when you come to a question that seems to be difficult in the understanding of the pasuk, and Rashi does not clarify anything, so then there's one of 2 options we can say. Oder as Al Pi Pshuti Shel Mikra is as Melchatchila Kein Kushyanit. Either the question that seems to be a question is not really a question. If you pay close attention to the pshat of the pasuk, you'll see how it's not a question. Oder as das is Muzbar Al Pi Pirish Rashi Shel Ofanov. Or if you remember something that Rashi said earlier, you'll see how this is not a question. In the Yitzdige Sedres is da an Inyan, was is nit muvan Al Pi Pshuti Shel Mikra, und Rashi stellt sich nit auf dem B'Pirushei. So here in these Sedres, which are Vayakel and Pekudei, there's an obvious question, and Rashi doesn't address it. And the question is as follows. In Parshas Vayakel, the zählt die Torah, wie Moshe Rabbeinu hat übergegeben zu Jiden, dem eibischen Zivi of Trumas HaMishkan, und mit alle Praten. So here in the Parsha Vayakel, the Torah tells us how Moshe Rabbeinu communicated to Yidden all of the details of the mitzvah of building the Mishkan. K'chu me'itchem trume, bringen zav, v'kesef, v'goymer, from melechas HaMishkan, all the different materials that are needed to build the Mishkan. Und danach, that zivui, auf asiyas HaMishkan v'cheilov, und euch l'chol prateim. And then the Torah says, HaMoshe Rabbeinu tells Yidden all the different parts of the Mishkan that have to be built, and he goes through them detail by detail. Nachdem die zählt die Torah, then the Torah says, wie Yidden haben gebracht, die Nidave, far melechas HaMishkan, und danach wird erzählt, and then the Torah again tells us, ubepratis, and in detail again, wie die Chachmei Lev haben gemacht den Mishkan, how they went and built the Mishkan, die Yiriyos, v'chulu, und alle Klei Mishkan, und be Parshasenu, and then in Parshas Pekudei, the Bigdei Kehuna, how they made the Bigdei Kehuna. So right here we can see that the Torah repeats the story of the building of the Mishkan twice. This is besides what was already said earlier in Parshas Truma and Tetzaveh. Here in the Parshas of Vayakel Pekudei, in the beginning of Parshas Vayakel, the Torah tells us how Moshe Rabbeinu commands Yidden to bring all the materials, and he tells them exactly what it is that has to be built. And then it tells us how all those donations were received, and they actually went ahead and built it, and the Torah goes through every single detail of what and how it was built. Was l'chayre wollt doch maspe gewähnen, wenn die Torah sagt bekitzer, als Moshe hat übergegeben zu Yidden dem ganzen Zivi von der Eibischen Nev Nidvas Vasiyas am Mishkan. Why wouldn't it be enough for the Torah just to say simply and concisely that Moshe Rabbeinu related to Yidden the command to build a Mishkan? Was sehr pratim sind da ausführlich in dem Zivi von dem Eibischen zu Moshe in Parshas Truma, Tetzaveh, Tisa. So all the details were already said earlier when the Torah relates how Hashem commands Moshe Rabbeinu to build the Mishkan in Parshas Truma, Tetzaveh, and Tisa. Everything is there already. So all it has to say over here is that Moshe Rabbeinu gave over to the Yidden this mitzvah to build the Mishkan, und danach soll stehen, Vayasu b'nei Yisrael k'chol asher tziva Hashem es Moshe, that Yidden could fulfill this mitzvah as the Hashem has commanded Moshe. Oder noch mehr bekitzer, or maybe you could even say it even in shorter version, without repeating at all that Moshe Rabbeinu gave over the tzivui to the Yidden, but just simply to say, Nachem de Zelen, tzivui HaKadosh Baruch Hu Moshe, soll stehen, there in Parshas Truma Tetzaveh and Kisisa, after it says all the details. So it should immediately say, Vayasu b'nei Yisrael k'chol asher tziva Hashem es Moshe, and that the Yidden fulfilled exactly the way Hashem commanded. As we find, the Torah uses this expression many times. And this is an expression that's used in these parshias here itself. Zu was darf von die alle Pratim noch einmal ausgerechnet werden, sei beim Übergeben dem Zivi zu den Jiden und sei beim Ausführen dem Zivi bepeil. Why is it repeated twice? More, besides what it already says in Truma Tetzaveh and Kisisa. So over here in Vayakal and Pekudei, it repeats twice, and as we'll see later, actually a third time, all of the details in the Mishkan when Moshe Rabbeinu gives over to Yidden what has to be done. And then when it says how it was actually done through Betzalel and all the Chachmei Lev. So this is the obvious question that all the Mefarshim discuss, as the Rebbe is mitzayin here in the Ha'aris, that many Mefarshim discussed this question already. Okay, in Order 12, the Rebbe is mitzayin to the Ramban, the Ralbag, and the Abarbanel that address this. Ubefrat, as an Onei Parshas Vayakel zogt Rashi. Rashi himself comments in the beginning of this week's Parsha here, Vayakel, Kva pirashti nidvas ha-mishkan u'malachta b'mokum tzavasam. I already explained all the details about the donations of the Mishkan and the work in the place where it was originally commanded. Was das sagt doch euch, as in the Parshias, is nitok kein chiddush of the friedige Parshas. So this itself, Rashi is letting you know, there's nothing new here. It's just a repetition. Und der Rebbe hat nicht da was zuzugeben, bepirushi da, so therefore he has nothing to add to what he already explained earlier. Wer doch noch starker dit mir? So if so, the question is even stronger. Oi bazoi, wollt doch lechayre die Teire, avade nicht gedarft ausrechnen in die Inyanim a zweiten Mal und a dritten Mal. So there's definitely no reason for the Teire to repeat it a second time and a third time. If Rashi himself says that there's no reason for him to explain everything again, so most definitely the Teire itself does not have to explain all these details again. Ha'amor is a shaila pshuta and pshuta shomikra. This is an obvious question in the pshat of the psukim here. Rashi does not give any explanation for this. Nit b'tchilas in Parshas Vayakel, not at the beginning, or nit b'siyim in unser sedre, and not in the end of Parshas Pekudei, the conclusion of the whole subject. There's nowhere where Rashi addresses this question. Und befragt, als auf Neze in Parshas Sisa, stellt sich Rashi up zu bewahren in die Überchazerung von bloß gezählte Werte. Rashi earlier in Parshas Kisisa, last week's Parsha, does stop to explain certain words that the Torah repeats again, why the Torah does it. Das was in the Torah steht dreimal, is a vashal gedi b'chalei v'imah. Why does the Torah repeat the same isser of basa b'chalav 3 times? So there Rashi stops on that. Be'ez da, seinen arichesdige hachpolis von ganze Parshias, the Torah is going through at length, repeating entire Parshas, and Rashi is of garnet mefarish. And nevertheless, Rashi does not bother addressing this at all. How could this be? The Rebbe in Order 16 points out that you have a similar thing regarding the Kabbanis of the Nesiim, and seemingly Rashi doesn't address it there either. But there is a hesber where the Rebbe explains what the reason is, al pi pshuta shel mikra, why the Torah repeats it. L'chayre wollt man gekent sagen. So seemingly we can answer as follows. As al kolpanem a chelik von der Shaila, werd verempfet al pi pirish Rashi in unser Parsha. A part of this question is answered according to what Rashi says later in this week's Parsha. Oifum pasik u Betzalel ben Uri geime asa es kol asher tziva Hashem es Moshe. That Betzalel built the Mishkan exactly the way Hashem commanded Moshe. Sagt Rashi. So Rashi explains, as Moshe tzivah Betzalel lasis tchilek kelim. Moshe Rabbeinu tells Betzalel to first build the kelim of the Mishkan, v'achakach Mishkan, and then the actual structure of the Mishkan itself, the Yiriyos and the Kroshim. Amalei Betzalel, so Betzalel responds to Moshe, but minega olam lasis tchila bayis v'achakach mesim kelim b'seichai. The regular conduct in the world is, first you build a home, and then you build the vessels, the furniture that you'll place inside the home. Amaloi, Moshe Rabbeinu answers Betzalel, you're right, and Kach Shamaytim Mipei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In fact, this is how I heard from the Eibishter that the order should be first the Mishkan and then the Kelim. And V'chein Asa, this is what Betzalel actually did. HaMishkan Tchila V'acha Kach Asa Kelim. First he built the Mishkan and then the Kelim, which is not the order of the way it's commanded in Parshas Teruma. Where over there it begins with the Aron and then the Shulchan and the Menorah and only afterwards the Yiriyas and the Kroshim. So you look in this week's parsha, you see the order, the way Betzalel built things. He began with the Yiriyos and the Kroshim, and only afterwards the Aron. So according to this, we would be able to answer, and as the Rebbe points in Order 20, this is the answer of the Barbanel, as das is the Tam, was by Asiyas HaMishkan Bepoil, wer noch einmal ist gerechnet, alle Prati HaMishkan Vekelov. When it comes to actually building the Mishkan, the Torah repeats all of the details of the Mishkan and the Kelim. So when you see here, the way the Torah repeats it in a different order, we can see that Betzalel reversed the order. From the way it was commanded in the Parsha of Teruma. Und gemacht frier the Mishkan und danach the Kelim. And he built first the Mishkan and then the Kelim. So that's the reason why the Torah repeats the whole Parsha to show you the change of order. And that this was Betzalel that saw this, and he was right, and this is the way Hashem intended it to be. Aber this answer is not at all sufficient to answer the question over here regarding the repetition of Parshas Vayakel and Pekudei. Neisuf of them. In addition to the fact, was lefizeh is noch alt nit mevur, fa was die Torah darf ausrechnen in die Protim, beim Sippur, wie Moshe hat übergegeben den Jiden, dem Zivui of Nitvas HaMishkan und of Asiyas HaMishkan Vekelov. This still does not explain why the Torah has to repeat again all of the details when Moshe Rabbeinu commands Yidden what they should be donating, which materials, and what details have to be built. As the Rebbe pointed out in the beginning of the Sikha, it's repeated twice in this week's Parsha. When Moshe Rabbeinu commands Yidden of all the details, and then when it's actually being built, the Torah goes through again exactly all the details, how it was built. So this answer, explaining that Betzalel switched the order of the Kelim before the Kelim being after the Mishkan, only explains why the Torah would repeat it again in the actual building. But when it comes to Moshe Rabbeinu commanding Yidden which materials have to be brought and which details have to be built, there's no reason for the Torah to repeat that. Even regarding the actual building of the Mishkan, where there is a chiddush here, that the order is different than before, but it still doesn't answer the whole length that the Torah goes through as far as relating this. Aleph number 1, Silibdem, if it's only just to point out the order that Betzalel switched from the way it was commanded in Trum and Tetzaveh, is genug der Chelek Asippe beteure, was erzählt, als man hat zum ersten gemacht den Mishkan, und danach hat man angegeben machen die Kelim. The only thing the Torah should include in this repeating the story here is to point out that first they made the Mishkan and then the Kelim. Aber the Sippe wegen Asiyas HaKelim, but all of the details about building the Kelim, or befrat Asiyas Bigdei Kohona, and also about all the Bigdei Kohona that were made, was werden ausgerechnet bei Parshas Seinu, which are then in great detail here in Parshas Pekudei, is doch in dem mit gewinnt kein Shini v'chidush bei Asiyas Betzalel. There was no change and there was nothing new of the way Betzalel did it. Everything was exactly the same as before. So the only thing that it's necessary for the Torah to point out is the change of order, not more. Beis ve'ikir, and the main point also here is, bichdei zu mit dir sein, dem Seder Asiyah, frier von dem Mishkan, und danach the Kelim, for the Torah to point out the change in order, that first the Mishkan is built, and then the Kelim. So even if the Torah is going to go through each one of the Kelim in detail that were built, but is nit neitig da'ariches und die Proteyat waren in der Asiyah, sehr mas v'cholo. It's still not necessary for the Torah to go through exactly every single detail of each individual one of the Kelim. The measurements of each one by the Aron, an am and a half, and 2.5 amas, and so on, each individual detail. So even if the Torah is going to go through every single one of the Kelim in detail, but why with every single detail, the measurements and everything else? Nachmer. Now the question goes even further, because really the Torah repeats the story and all the details of the Mishkan and the Kelim a third time, besides what it already says in Parshas Teruma. Nach the Achbalas Apratim Anal. after what we've already pointed out before, that the Torah repeats it twice. When es kommt to Parshasenu zu Vayaviu es Mishkan el Moshe, after everything is built, and they bring everything to Moshe. So Gimel, another major question here is, Rechent eis die Torah vidramo, alle protei advarim from Mishkan v'kelev chulu. A third time, the Torah repeats all of the Mishkan and the Kelim, everything that they brought to Moshe. And here as well, why does it have to repeat it a third time? If it's coming to say that they brought everything to Moshe, I could just simply say they brought the Mishkan and all the Kelim to Moshe. Why does it repeat it again? And Daled, noch dem, after all of this, is the Pasuk Esht Mesayim. The Pasuk concludes finally, Kachol asher tziva Hashem es Moshe, Kain Oster b'nei Yisrael es kol aveda. The way they were commanded, this is the work, this is the way they did so. No, so this is the pasuk, the only pasuk that should be said right at the beginning, and everything else until here is completely extra. So this is the big question over here. It's not only a repetition, but the Torah actually repeats after Parshas Teruma again all the details of the Mishkan and the Kelim 3 times. Why is this the case? So the answer, the explanation here, the Pashtus, is very simple. As the Rebbe pointed out, if Rashi doesn't address this, so the answer has to be very obvious and simple. The Mishkan, the Kelim, is from the Inyanim Achi Ikriyim V'Chavivim B'Yidin. The Mishkan and its Kelim are one of the most important and cherished things that Yidden have. Durch them is given Ashras Ashchina B'Yidin V'Chulu. First of all, this is the place where the Shechina dwells amongst the Yidden. Befrat, and in more in detail, there's another point here, as der Mishkan wird angerufen kifi pirish Rashi beParshasenu. Rashi says in the beginning of the Parsha what the meaning of the name of the word Mishkan is. Mishkan ha'edus. What does the word edus mean? It's a testimony. Edus li Yisrael shevitelem HaKadosh Baruch Hu al Ma'aseh Egel. This is a testimony for Yidden that the Eibishter forgave them on the Chet HaEgel. Sha'arei hishra shchinase b'neihem. As we can see that the Eibishter is now dwelling amongst Yidden once again. Was the fun is noch mehr moving the chavivos and inyan klalisha bezeh. We can understand even more how cherished, how beloved the Mishkan is, and how central and important it is. Varam Chet HaEgel is given der Chet Achi Gadol v'Klali. Chet HaEgel is considered to be the greatest and most general sin that happened amongst Klal Yisrael. Was hat geiren given zum gresten hester panim from the Eibishten. It brought about the greatest concealment, so the Eibishter concealing himself from Klal Yisrael. Bis zu the gzeres kloya rachman al-Islan of Yidden. That at the beginning, initially, there was a gzeira to wipe out all of Klal Yisrael. Bis as a fila nach der Sliche, even after Hashem forgives Yidden, hat der Eibishter gesagt, that any time in the future, when Yidden sin and the Eibishter punishes them, there's also an additional punishment because of the Chet HaEgel. So we see how powerful this Aveda was and what kind of a Hester Panim it caused. Und der Fun is move only so from seeing how powerful the Chet is, we could understand on the other side, as the Mishkan, was durch him is hishrish chinasi b'neim. So finally, when the Yidden are given the mitzvah to build a Mishkan and bring the Shechina amongst them, is this an inyan klali v'naila adma'id. This is the most central and greatest and highest thing that the Torah tells us about that Yidden experienced then. Und bemeile ist verstandig, als auch die große Chavivos von dem Mishkan beim Eibishten bei Yidden, so this tremendous love that the Eibishter has to the Mishkan, and the Yidden also have for this Mishkan, that they're being forgiven, and the Eibishter is here amongst them, das ist der Tam, was der Torah rechnet ist, alle Prati am Mishkan, und chazet sie iber einmal und noch einmal chole mit alle Pratim. Something is so beloved, so you repeat it again and again. You can't stop thinking about it. You can't stop speaking about it. And therefore the Torah repeats it over here in the parashas of Vayakal Pekudei no less than 3 times because of how beloved this is by the Eibishter and Yidden. Und im Tam darf Rashi da nit mefarish sein. This explanation, it's not necessary for Rashi to explain it here again. This is something which is self-understood based on what Rashi said before. This idea that there's something repeated in the Torah when it's something that's unique and special, we see it already before in what Rashi said in Parshas Chayesara. Auf dem, was nach dem, wie die Torah erzählt, wegen allem Morais von Eliezer, Eved Avram, in Bescheiches, ein Game, bringen Rivken. When the Torah reviews all the details that happened to Eliezer when he went to bring Rivka, Chazet say the Torah ibe noch einmal in sein Erzählen es von Mishpachas Rivka. So Eliezer tells the story of what happened, how he came, and how he met Rivka. The Torah repeats all the details of what happened. Is Rashi masber, and das is mitzad the chavivus von the minyan. So Rashi there essentially says that it's because of how important and how beloved the story is. What Amar Rabbi Acha says, Yofe, sichasan shel avdei avos lefnei hamakim miterasan shel banim. It's more beautiful by the Eibishter, the story of Eliezer, which was from the Avdei Avis, a servant by Avraham Avinu, more even than the Torah of the Yidden and the children. Shaharei Parsha Shel Eliezer Kfula B'Torah. This story of Eliezer is repeated twice in Torah. Many very important things in Torah are only hinted to. So we see how important the story of Avdei Avis is. So Rashi already showed us this point. When something is very beloved and something is very special, the Torah repeats it again. Weiß von davon, als ein Inyan, was es Chava beim Eibischen, ist die Teire das Keufel, mit alle Pratim, Hagam, es kommen dazu, kein Chidushim in them, although there is nothing new here. Und al derech zeh binyaneinu. So it's understood that the same applies over here when it comes to the Mishkan, which was something so general, so central to Yidden, and so important, and so beloved, as the Rebbe explained before. And therefore, befashtein, however, if we're basing the Pshat over here on what Rashi said before regarding Avdei Batei Avis. So the question though is, can we really learn out from there? From them Pirish Rashi is l'chayra mochach fakert. From what Rashi explains there, it would seem that the contrary is true. That is to the contrary. As the tam is nitshayach binyanenu. The reason said over there does not apply here. Yofes sichasan shel Avdei Avis miterasan shel banim. Isn't the emphasis that the story of Avdei Avis is greater and more beautiful than the mitzvahs that it says later in the Torah? Meint doch kipshuto, so doesn't it simply mean, as by Teirasan Shalbanim, was nach Matan Torah, gefit bin it as chavivus. That by the Torah given to the Yidden later after Matan Torah, we don't find this type of chavivus that we find by Eliezer. Was zu libdem soll bei sei sein dem Iyun von Kfula B'Torah, wie bei Sichasan Shel Avdei Avis. That it should be reviewed again and again like it was by Avdei Avis. Kann man doch nicht sagen, Oter Hezbe bei Asiyas HaMishkan was is Teirasan Shel Banim. So if so, we can't apply what Rashi explains there regarding the repetition of Avdei Avis to over here after Matan Torah regarding the Mishkan V'Kelov that the Torah repeats again and again, because isn't Rashi pointing out that this is something which is unique regarding Avdei Avis in contrast to Teirasan Shel Banim? So the beer and the answer is, no, we're misunderstanding what Rashi is saying. The kavana from the maime was Rashi bringt, Yofis yichasan shel Avdei Avis mit Teirasan shel banim. What is the pshat when Rashi says that the story of Avdei Avis is more beautiful than Teirasan shel banim? Is nicht zu madgish sein dem Yisrael von Avdei Avis oiv banim. The main point here is not the contrast of the Avdei Avis of Eliezer being an Eved Avram to the children, to the Yidden later. That he, Eliezer Eved Avram, has an advantage and is on a greater level, in some sense, more than Yidden. That's not the point. Not a reise bringen dem Ilui v'chavivus lefamim von sicha legabi Torah. Rather, the main focus and the main thing we're emphasizing over here is that sometimes there's an advantage and more of a love for sicha, for the story that it says in Torah, than the actual mitzvahs of the Torah. So we're really contrasting sicha to Torah. That's the main emphasis. And what is really sicha? When we say here that we're contrasting sicha to Torah, aren't they both in the Torah? They're both part of Torah. So what really is the difference between sicha and Torah? The chilek zwischen zei kipshuta is, the difference between the two very simply is, Torah meant, the meaning of Torah when we use this term in contrast to sicha, hoirais, tzivuyim, vidinim, instruction, commands, and the halachas. Was der Rebbe hat angesagt, was wie zu tun, exactly what and how to fulfill mitzvahs. That's the term Torah. Sicha meant, so in this sense, when we use the term sicha in contrast to Torah, so what is this referring to? Adibur, something that's being said in Torah. It's also part of Torah, but it's something which was begolu, ubipshuta, is nit kein siviv vahira. Looking at it in what it says, simply in revealed sense, it's not a command, it's not a halacha, not a sipur, was mitayr, a matziv. It's just a story being related about whatever incident happened, a pasirung, a pu'ula, chayetze b'zeh. Any story or any activity that takes place that the Torah relates. That's the sicha of Torah. So within Torah itself, there are these two aspects of Torah. There are the halachas of Torah, and the stories of Torah. Und wie das ist bei Eliezer Eved Avram al Pipshutai, so the story about Eliezer Eved Avram, was hat erzählt wegen Avram, wie Yitzchak, und was mit ihm hat getroffen, that Eliezer Eved Avram speaks about what happened to him, where he came from, and what happened at the Kvitzes HaDerech, wie der Rebischter hat den Masbe gewinnt, Rivka und V'chulu, how quickly he was able to come, and how he immediately met Rivka, and so on. This is all Sicha in Torah. This is the story that Eliezer is speaking about in Torah. So that is the Chiddush over here that Rashi is saying, that sometimes the story aspects of Torah has an advantage over the mitzvahs and the halachas of Torah. So now the Rebbe will explain, even though it does say Avdei Avis in contrast to Teiras and Shalbanim, but here's how you have to read this Rashi. Is there Maime Madgish di Mailo von Sicha. This statement of Rav Acha is coming to emphasize the advantage that there is to the Sicha, to the story aspect of Torah. As the Sicha, the stories, afilu von Avdei Avis, even if it's a story only from a servant from the Avis. In other words, the Avdei Avis being said here is saying, even if it's only a story from the servants of the Avis, is Lefa'amim Yafeh, von Teirasan, afilu Shalbanim. More beautiful than the Torah, even if that Torah is the instructions and the mitzvahs of the Torah to the Yidden. So the term Avdei Avis and Teiras and Shalbanim is being used here just to emphasize the Chiddush of how far this goes, that the stories of Torah has an advantage over the mitzvahs of the Torah, even if it's a story from Avdei Avis, in contrast to mitzvahs that are even from Banim. But the main point here is that the stories of Torah sometimes have a maila over the actual mitzvahs, where the mitzvahs are given beremez, and the stories can be repeated again and again. So we can understand how this applies, what Rashi says before in Parshas Chayesara applies to the Parshas here. Noch the Sederis Trume Tetzave. After the Sederis of Trume and Tetzave, so this same thing applies. Our Parshas are considered to be Sicha. Even though it might seem that in Vayakal and Pekudei, beginning of Vayakal, it's a command. Moshe is commanding Yidden what to do and what to bring and how to build a Mishkan. But this will also be included in the section of Sicha in Torah. Why? Because over here, there's nothing new that the Torah is telling us about what and the instructions what to do. Und was an dem wat man es nicht gewusst, that without the Torah saying it, that we wouldn't know this. Die Torah, die zählt, beprottius und barucha, wie Moshe Rabbeinu hat die alle Zivuyen vom Eibischen wegen Melechas HaMishkan übergegeben zu Yidden. The only point here is, we already know of the command that the Eibisher told Moshe. So over here, even though it seems to be also a mitzvah, but it's just Moshe Rabbeinu repeating and the Torah telling us the story that Moshe Rabbeinu gave over that command to Yidden, the mitzvah to Yidden. Und wie sie haben das Mekayim gewinnt bepoil v'chulu, and then how they actually went ahead and built the Mishkan bepoil. Das heißt, das ist eine Inyan von Sicha. So therefore, Trume and Tetzave is just relating the story of the Mishkan. Und wie bald, as die Sicha is benegei the Mishkan. So since this is a story about the Mishkan, is das azay chaviv. As we pointed out before, the Mishkan is something that's so beloved, as to leave them, kommt der Ariches und b'chol ha'pratim in an oifen von Kfula b'Teira. And therefore the Torah reviews it, repeats it again and again with all of the details. So we can see how this is connected to the Rashi before. Rashi already answered this, Rashi already clarified this. In the name of Rav Acha, the same thing applies over here to the story of the Mishkan. Al Pizez move on, was Rashi bringt beParshas Chayesara arab dem Shem von Balamayim Rav Acha. We could now understand why Rashi, when he quotes this idea, that sometimes the stories of Torah are more beloved than the mitzvahs of Torah, so Rashi brings also the one that said this, Rav Acha. Was das is, kib meduva kam bepamim, to leave them, was the name from Balamemere, gitzu ha-teisvis bir and avanas ha-pirish. Rashi only brings the name of the one that says the pshat if it adds a clarification, an understanding of the pshat that he says. Durch meitig sein, dem Shem Rav Acha. By bringing the name of Rav Acha, Vert mevuer der Teuchen von Maimer Yafis Yichoshen Shalavdei Avis Chulu. This clarifies the content of what Rav Acha was saying, that it's more beautiful, the Sicha of Avdei Avis. And we can see, based on the one that said this, as the Rebbe will soon explain, as the Adgoshe is nitten dem Yisren, from the Avdei Avis Legabi Banim, we're not trying primarily to contrast Avdei Avis to Banim, that Avdei Avis have an advantage over Banim. Nor in the Mailu von Sicha, What we're contrasting here is we're expressing that there's an advantage in the stories of Torah, in the Sicha of Torah, more than the Torah of Torah, the Tzivuyim of the Torah. That's the main emphasis. As we'll see, Rav Acha is the one that spoke about this distinction. Und der Tam, was es ist möglich, as es soll sein, Yofis Yichasa mit Tirasan. And therefore, it's possible that there should be an advantage in the stories of Torah more than the Torah itself. In other words, more than the Tzivuyim and the mitzvahs, the halachas of the Torah. So where do we see that Rav Acha makes this kind of a distinction between Sicha in Torah and the Torah in Torah? In Masechta Yoma werd gebracht the Breise. There's a Breise brought in the Gemara, Ton Rabbanon v'dibarta bam. So what do we learn out from this? Bam v'loy b'tfilah. In Torah and not in Tfilah. Rashi there explains it means that when you learn Torah, you have to learn and say the words loud, but when you daven Shmei Nesra, you daven balachash, you daven the silent Shmei Nesra. V'dibarta bam. Bam yesh l'cha reshus l'daber. So another drasha we learn out from v'dibarta bam, that it's the words of Torah that you have permission to speak, v'loy b'dvarim acherim, and not to speak other words which simply would refer to dvarim b'teilim, pointless words. Or Rashi there actually says it refers to sichas hayaladim, kalas roish, idle chatter, and things that are just frivolous talk and things that are not necessary to speak. So that's what we learn out from v'dibarta bam. A Yid has a constant mitzvah always to use his time to learn Torah and not to speak other silly things. Then the Braisa continues. Rabbi Acha says, V'dibarta bam. What does v'dibarta bam mean? Asay oisan kva. So make your learning of Torah to be permanent, something that you do permanently and focus on. Valtasem arai. And your learning of Torah shouldn't be this temporary exercise. So Rabbi Acha has a different pshat, a different interpretation of what you learn out from v'dibarta bam. So it may seem that Rabbi Acha is just saying a different pshat, and he's not at all relating to what the Tanna Kama and this Braisa said. But however, as the Rabbi here will explain, the words of Rabbi Acha are being brought after the drasha of the Tanna Kama. So it seems like Rabbi Acha is arguing. Rabbi Acha comes and argues and has a different pshat in v'dibarta bam. He disagrees with the first pshat that the Tanna Kama says. So the Rebbe will address that over here. Was l'chayre, von dem was Rabbi Acha sagt, nor the chiyuv und die shlile, b'negeya divrei Torah, Rabbi Acha says that the drasha from v'dibarta bam is just coming to say the obligation or the positive and the negative regarding your attitude. When you learn Torah, asay oisam kva val tasem marai, that it should be permanent and not temporary. Unit kein shlile b'negeya zu dvarim acherim. And he doesn't interpret v'dibarta bam to come to negate any dvarim acherim, that you should not speak dvarim acherim. Wie sagt sein Bal Plukte, as the Tanna Kama, which he seems to be arguing with, is saying, Fardem, v'dibarta bam v'loy b'dvarim acherim. V'dibarta bam comes to tell me, speak words of Torah. You have a constant obligation to always use your time for speaking Torah and not other idle chatter. Rav Acha doesn't interpret it that way. Rav Acha says, no, the Torah is just coming to tell you the attitude you should have when you learn. Is mashma, so it seems, as by dvarim acherim, is loit Rav Acha nit chal di shlila. When it comes to other things, speaking other things outside of Torah, so he disagrees with the Tanna Kama, and we don't negate that. We can't learn out, we do not learn out from v'dibarta bam to negate any other speech, dvarim acherim. But if so, the question is, tziden kem sagen, as ladas Rav Acha is da a heter of dvarim acherim betelim. According to Rav Acha, if a person has time to learn Torah, he can use his time for other things, to not learn Torah, not to speak words of Torah, and just to go speak dvarim acherim betelim, just to speak idle chatter, other words that are not words of Torah. How could we say that Rav Acha is arguing with what the Tanna Kama says? Why is he bringing a different drasha that only focuses on the attitude of that you should have when you learn? And he seemingly disagrees with the drasha of the Tanna Kama that negates, that says v'dibarta bam simply means to negate, speak words of Torah constantly and not anything else. So based on this, the Rebbe shows us an original thing, an original pshat over here, what Rav Acha is saying, and we'll see over here in the words of Rav Acha the distinction between Torah and Sicha. All within Torah itself. There is the Torah section of Torah, the mitzvahs of the Torah, and the Sicha, the stories of the Torah. So now the beer in them is the explanation for what Rav Acha is saying, why Rav Acha does not want to exclude dvarim acherim. Rav Acha is madgish as b'negei ledivrei Torah. when it comes to learning Torah, is a chiyuv, tmidi, ubehechlet, as es darf sein, v'dibarte bam, unkva, unit arai. As far as learning Torah is concerned, so here, there's a constant obligation to learn Torah, and it's absolute that you always should be learning Torah, and your attitude in learning should be that it's permanent and not just something that you're doing temporarily. However, as far as excluding dvarim acherim, dvarim acherim cannot be completely negated. When you say dvarim acherim is a very broad expression. What's included in dvarim acherim? There's all kinds of things that go into dvarim acherim. Rashi says dvarim acherim would include sichas hayaladim and kalas reish. Dvarim acherim could be dvarim betelim. But dvarim acherim could also mean things within Torah itself that are not the mitzvahs of the Torah, that's not the Torah of the Torah. That's also part of dvarim acherim. So again, aber b'negei dvarim acherim, that cannot be excluded completely. There are included in the expression of dvarim acherim in contrast to Torah is sicha, the sicha section of Torah, the stories of the Torah. So when the pasuk here is saying v'dibarta bam, what is that referring to? The mitzvah v'dibarta bam, to learn Torah constantly, refers to not just learning the stories of Torah, but to learn the mitzvahs and the halachas of the Torah. Later on in the Sikh, in Order 36, the Rebbe quotes from the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch that you see the Alter Rebbe teaches it this way. V'dibarta bam refers to learning the halachas, the taryag mitzvahs of the Torah. So anything, even within Torah itself, which is not part of the mitzvahs of the Torah, is included in dvarim acherim. So the stories of Torah is also dvarim acherim. So that cannot be negated completely. So therefore, Rav Acha does not say, like the Tanna Kama, that we negate that. Dvarim acherim betelim is the snit. So the stories of the Torah are not dvarim betelim. You can't say that it's like idle chatter. So zabereich nit Torah, but it's also not Torah. In what sense of Torah does haste? Does it nit ken herois tzivuyim v'dinim v'chol ha'shaychim lezeh? It's not the mitzvahs of the Torah, the instructions, the halachas of the Torah. Nor diburim v'sipurim. It's the stories of the Torah. V'nyani yesayreros, the things in Torah that will awaken you to serve and connect to the Eibishter. Okay, so therefore we can see over here that Rav Acha is the one that makes a distinction between the Torah and sicha within Torah itself, which l'chayre would mean that this is the argument here between the Tanna Kama and Rav Acha. The Tanna Kama holds when it says v'dibarta bam, which refers to Torah, it refers to all parts of Torah. The mitzvahs of the Torah, the stories of the Torah, it's all together in one category. And therefore when the Tanna Kama negates dvarim acherim, he's referring to dvarim betelim, or to sichas hayaladim and kalas reish, as Rashi says. So therefore that is totally excluded. On the other hand, Rav Acha though says, no, we can't exclude dvarim acherim, because really when it says v'dibarta bam, it's not referring to the stories of Torah. V'dibarta bam only refers to the taryag mitzvahs of the Torah, to learn about the mitzvahs. So when you want to exclude dvarim acherim, how could you say v'loi dvarim acherim, that you shouldn't learn any time the stories of Torah? You can't say that. Of course, there's also times that you should be learning the stories of Torah as well. Ubemele can sein azah sicha euch yafe bis azah sicha was wird sein yafe mit Teirasan. So since the sicha within Torah itself is another category in Torah, so therefore there's something that's beautiful about that, and that's not negated, and sometimes you have to learn the stories of Torah as well, and there's actually sometimes even an advantage to those stories even more than the mitzvahs of Torah. Aber von deswegen, however, even though both the Torah, the mitzvahs of Torah and the sicha of Torah are both part of Torah, from deswegen, nevertheless, is dafke benegei Torah regarding the mitzvahs of the Torah that tzivui aseyos and kvav al tasen marai, that should be your main occupation, your main permanent occupation as far as learning Torah should be not in the stories of Torah but in the mitzvahs and learning the taryag mitzvahs of the Torah. Warum es ist selbstverständlich, it's self-understood, euch fahre ben chomisch, even for a child, as man muss allemal gedenken, und bemele chazeren, und reden und lernen, die herois, die Teire, was man muss tun, und was man tun nicht tun, und also weiter. The actual mitzvahs of the taryag mitzvahs is much more important to constantly learn and review, to know the mitzvahs of the Torah. And regarding that, Rav Acha is saying, asay oisan kva val tasim arai. He was referring specifically to the mitzvahs of the Torah. But, of course, from time to time, a person should also be learning the stories of the Torah, the Hisairos, the Sipurim, that bring Hisairos in Torah. That's also a part of Torah, but it's another category in Torah, though. So here's where we see that Rav Ache makes this distinction, and therefore Rashi quotes by name Rav Ache, and now we can understand that what Rashi says in Parshas Chayesara, his main point was to distinguish between the Sicha and Torah in Torah, and therefore that applies to the Parshias of Truma and Tetzaveh, and then the Vayakol, Pekudei as well. The explanation of this in Al-Pi Chassidus. In the zwei Sedres, wo es werden übergechazet, alle Protia, Mishkan veKelov. If we look at these two Parshias of Vayakol and Pekudei, where it repeats the details of the Mishkan and the Kelims, and in that zwei Nekudas Klolius. There are two general points that are made here in the repetition. Aleph, number one, the Nedivus Halei from the Yidden, the generosity that Yidden gave with a full heart. Was sie haben gebracht, bezrizes achi gedeila. They brought, and with tremendous alacrity, alle neutike Sachen fahren Mishkan und an Eufen von Nedivus Halei. Everything necessary with a generous heart. Bis as man hat gedarft ausrufen al Yasued Malache und es gewend verheiße. It was necessary to announce, not to bring more, and it was more than enough. So that's the Nedivus Halei of the Yidden. And Beis, as the Chachmei Leiv haben Mekayim gewend Tzivya Kadosh Baruch Hu, the fulfillment of the mitzvah, und Getan Meleches HaMishkan, the Keilah of all the details. Building the Mishkan and the Keilim is a lot of very meticulous details that you have to pay attention to, and they fulfilled everything precisely. Kechol HaShetziva Hashem es Moshe, and the Rebbe asked, Kechol HaShetziva Hashem, wie es ist Tziva Hashem es Moshe, meaning the way the Eibishter really told Moshe Rabbeinu originally, that the Mishkan should be done first and then the Kelim. We can see these 2 points, how they come together. When Yidden came and brought the Nedavos of the Mishkan, is given the Kiyum Matzivui. Bedugmas Evet. The Yidden came and they brought every single detail, all the materials, exactly what they were commanded, like an Eved that's told to do something. The Yidden came and brought everything exactly. Von Eibishten. And it also says, as we mentioned before, they brought with heart. By the melacha von kochach melev is given the soy liboy. So we also see that they brought with heart. So even though if you look in general regarding Yidden, the Torah emphasizes the fact that they brought with Nedivus Halev, with a generous heart, and by the Chachmei Lev, the Torah emphasizes exactly all the details, how everything was built with every single measurement, precisely how they were commanded. But these two details come together. The Yidden fulfilled in action every single detail as commanded, and also with heart, with the Nidvas Halev, and the Chachmei Lev that built the Mishkan also. What they did, in precisely what they were told, was also done with heart, with Nesai Libai. So those are the two details that we see over here. The fulfillment exactly, like an Eved, and being done with the Lev, with heart. So here the Rebbe will point out that B'pnimiyus Yanim, what Rashi says in Parshas Chayesara, that Yafis Yichasan Shalav the Yavis Mitirasan Shalbanim applies to this week's parsha. Even though the Rebbe before explained Ba'arichis that the comparison from what Rashi says there to this week's parsha is as far as the difference between Sicha versus Teira, but not the distinction between Avdei Yavis and the Teirasan Shalbanim. However, B'pnimiyus Yanim, we can see how both the points of Sicha and the point of Avdei Yavis, Avdei, does apply also in this week's parsha as well. Sicha, the expression of Sicha, is verbunden mit Leiv, is related to the heart of the Yid. Varim Sicha is doch der Inyan hat Tefillah, kamayim razal. Sicha is an expression used in Torah many times for davening. Und Tefillah is the Chavedische Belev. Davening is the Aveda of the heart. So therefore the Sicha here refers to the fact that this is a story about the heart of the Yidden, what they gave with a generous heart. Und Eved, Avdei Yavis, Eved is madgish der Inyan von Kiyam HaMitzvahs. A servant that serves, he's obedient, he fulfills exactly what he's told to do. That's what an Eved is. Mekayim sein Tzivyaden, and that's the unique thing that you see of it. This is a major project, building the Mishkan with all the details. A lot goes into it, and they fulfilled everything precisely how they were told. Those are the two details that the Torah says here. Nidvas HaMishkan, Divas HaLev von Yidden, the generous heart of Yidden, which is Inyan HaSicha. That's the Sicha, meaning not only a story, like the Rebbe said before, this is the story of the Mishkan, but it's also the heart of the Yidden in building the Mishkan. On the Kiyam Atzivi von Asiyas HaMishkan, and the Torah goes through in detail how they actually fulfilled every detail, which is Evet, to show and to express the fact that Yidden fulfilled exactly what they were told. Those two details, the Evet and the Leiv, the Sicha and the Avdeyav, is similar to the expression that Rashi uses in Parshas Chayei Sarah. Oh, es darf sein, die Iskalos von Oti Beide. These two things, the heart and the fulfillment, precisely in the details, have to come together. As the Rebbe said before, these two things come together, so these two things have to be blended together. Meaning, as the kiyum ha-mitzvahs, inyan eved, when you're doing something, a mitzvah, and you're focusing on the details, so you may get very caught up with the technical aspect of the mitzvah, the actual halacha of how to fulfill the mitzvah, but this itself as well, darf sein zusammen mit nidivas halev. It has to be infused with heart, it has to be infused with your heart that you put into the mitzvah. That's on one hand. And also on the other hand, only the nidivas halev, and the heart that you have, the excitement and your heart that you have in the mitzvah, darf sich aneren, das is mitzatzivia kadosh baruch Hu. It shouldn't just be your feeling and your excitement that you're doing the Eibishter's mitzvah, but you should sense that it's not me, my feeling, but I'm fulfilling the Eibishter's mitzvah. And every single detail that he wants has to be done precisely the way he said so. So that's the inclusion of the two details here that we see in the Parsha, the Nedivus Halev of the Yidden, and also the Kechol HaShetziva Hashem Es Moshe, that the Yidden fulfill exactly the mitzvah the way the Eibishter said, and these two things come together here.